Hi, before we get started, I want to let you know that these cross-stitch videos are not for somebody who's never cross-stitched ever before. These are for people who have done a little bit of cross-stitch, know the general gist of what you're supposed to do, and have completed one kit project, maybe 2 or 3 in the past, and are starting to want to learn more. Each of these videos, including this one, starts simply, gets advanced, and then ultimately discusses how to go through the process of picking what you need. So just so you know, if you've never cross-stitched a day in your life and know nothing about it, I have included a playlist from another creator that actually goes into how to cross-stitch for basic beginners. Go watch that, go complete your first project or 2 from a kit, and then come back here so that you can learn everything you really need about the different aspects of a cross-stitch project. Now, on to the video. Hi, I'm Teresa from Phoenix Gate Crafts, and welcome to part 1 of my 4-part series all about cross-stitch. So this is specifically cross-stitch and not embroidery. Now, cross-stitch is technically a part of embroidery. It's kind of its own little subsect because we do things a bit differently than pure embroidery. And this video is all about fabric and needles, because choosing your fabric determines your needles. It determines your floss, or I should say what you do with your floss. It affects the size of your end product, and as a result, everything else is kind of dependent on the fabric that you get, specifically the size of the fabric. So I'm going to go through some of the options, how to figure out what you have, how to figure out what you need. Yes, there is math involved. I will show you how to do it. You can use a calculator. But basically in any craft, if you don't like math, you're kind of screwed, because there's at least a little bit of math in everything, even if that math is just counting. So, let's start with fabric options. The most common fabric is Aida. This is the cheap shit that you get at the big box store. Now this one I got off of Amazon, and it is a sort of pre-made bookmark. But you can get just yards of this off of some online websites. This is the most common one that you will find in a kit. This is 14 count Aida. Now, don't worry about counts. We'll be getting into counts in a little bit, but Aida is the most common and the cheapest fabric you can get. It is typically 100% cotton. It is not particularly soft or nice feeling. It technically, some people say it has a front, like a right side and a wrong side, or a front side and a back side. I don't know about that. I've never been able to tell the difference. I know this is the front side because it's the pretty side, and this is the ugly side. But that's only because this is a pre-made bookmark. But the cool thing about Aida is, because it is 100% cotton, it is machine washable. Now you'll want to do something with the edges like this, and we'll talk about that later, but you can wash it in the washing machine as long as you've done something to prevent the edges from fraying. That's kind of why this is the most popular for cheap shit kits. It's also very popular for anything that you're going to be doing what we call full coverage, where you're going to basically stitch in every single one of these little boxes. Because if you look closely at it, you will see these little holes. All of the fabrics that we use in cross stitch have tiny little holes, and you can see that they line up in a sort of grid. That's going to be important for later when we figure out count. Those holes are super important. So although I do recommend Aida for newbies, especially if you're on a budget or whatnot, it is by no means the only option that you have. The second option is linen. And yes, I do still have the sticker so I can remember what I'm using this for. So linen is a very popular option. This is raw, natural Edinburgh linen. And as you can see, there's a bit of a difference. I mean, we're going to ignore the fact that this is 36 count and this is 14 count for the moment. So this one has bigger little grids. But you can see that the fabric itself is quite a bit different. It's a little bit slubby. You can see in the texture that there are slightly thicker bits of just kind of fiber that just kind of doesn't fit in the weave. Those are called slubs. You get slubby yarn sometimes if you knit or crochet. And this just creates a texture. It creates more of an old-timey texture. Now this is undyed, so this is like pure plant. Linen is the fiber of the flax plant. And it creates this kind of old-timey, rough look. But you don't have to get pure linen that is undyed. But linen itself is kind of its own category. So linen really depends. It may or may not be machine washable. Typically linen is, but it depends kind of on how your linen is finished. Like any of this depends on how the linen is finished. You can iron both Aida and linen. Being plant fibers, they are very receptive to it. The trick is if they are dyed, you may not be able to. So these are both very sturdy. Like this looks so much more delicate than this, but this is also very, very sturdy. And the fiber, a trick of linen is that it softens as you use it. Now there is a trick to using linen because as you can see, it does still have holes. Now this is very fine. It doesn't have like this one has several threads going sideways and then a hole, and then a few more going sideways and then a hole. This one typically doesn't quite operate that way. So there are videos that will actually give you instructions on how to start a cross-stitch piece on linen. I've never actually used linen before. This is the first linen I've ever purchased. So I'm not going to tell you how to do that. I just know that there are some special techniques for getting started on linen. Now, if you want something nicer than Aida, but not as slubby or as tricky as linen, you might want the third category, which is more of a catch-all category called even weave. Now, technically, Aida is a type of even weave, but that's not what we're talking about when we say even weave. We are talking about a variety of fabrics that are evenly the same number of threads and then a hole, and then the same number of threads going one way and then a hole going vertically and horizontally. So you can totally have linen even weave. So I wasn't sure when I got this if this would technically be linen even weave. This does not look like it. But you can definitely see more of the slub in this one versus the rough, versus this. But here is true even weave. This one is just called even weave. I do not know what fiber this is at all. 1/8 yard, 36 count, white even weave fabric. It doesn't specify. This could be cotton. But this is a lot nicer than the Aida. Aida is typically stiffened using some kind of like cornstarch or other kind of starch, fabric starch. This feels so much nicer. It is 36 count versus 14 count. Don't worry, we will explain that. But this even weave has a different quality to it. And it's not necessarily cotton or linen. You could have other fibers such as Lugana. This is Lugana, and this is Lugana. Wedgwood Lugana. I think Wedgwood is just the color versus the red. But these, even amongst themselves, because this is 25 count and this is 25 count, but the dye sometimes or the processing can make them feel different. So just know you have different fiber options. With even weave, you need to know specifically what fiber is in it. Now, if you're ever not sure about if something can go in the washer, always feel free to hand wash. When in doubt, hand wash. I know it doesn't rhyme, but that is just some very good advice. And ultimately, depending on how you process through your project and how you decide to finish your project, you might just wind up wanting to hand wash anyway, especially if you're in the no knots camp. You definitely don't want to machine wash with no knots because your stitching will come out. The mathy part, the count. So this is Aida. This is Aida that my friend Amy gave me. This is 28 count Aida. And this is 14 count Aida. Aside from the fact that this Aida is dyed, there is only one difference between this Aida and this Aida, and that is the count. As you can see, if we look real close, you can see that these little grids are bigger by quite a bit than these little grids. These are absolutely tiny little grids. You can still see that they exist. They go horizontally and vertically. They are just a quarter the size. Each little square on here is going to be a quarter the size of this one. Now I'm going to show you on graph paper because it's just easier that way. So on here we have a grid going vertically and horizontally just like the fabric. And on each one of these intersections we have a dot. You see how when we connect 4 of these dots we make a square. And we have another square. And we have another square. And we have another square. All the way across. Now, I'm going to just go ahead and make a lot of these. These squares that we make in our imaginations on this grid, that is the key to cross stitch. And it is so important because, well, first of all, we have a grid in our pattern. So this is how we know where we are in our pattern. And we need to be able to see this. So by counting how many squares we have in an inch, we can tell what count fabric we have. So for example, if I was going to count this grid paper, I line up the 0 on the first dot. And I go for an inch. Fortunately, that lines up perfectly. So I don't count the dot on the 0 or the hole on the 0. I start counting afterwards because we're counting squares, we're not counting holes. So we've got 1 square, 2, 3, 4, 5. Stop at the 1 inch. It is a little different in the UK or any place that does metric, but in the US, we do it based on the inch. It's the same process regardless of where you're going. So this is 5 squares per inch, which means that this is 5 count graph paper. Now, if I were to do this same thing on here, I know you can't see it for squat, but you can line it up and you do it based on the holes. So I've got it lined up to this hole, and then we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 is right on that one. This is 14 count. And if I were to do that on this one, which I'm not going to do because I am too blind for this, I would have 28 stitches in 1 inch. And you'll notice that on these different fabrics, I have 36 count. That means there's 36 squares in 1 inch. This is 25 count. That means there's 25 squares in 1 inch. They tell me. You always want to know. And if you don't know, you can always just do this thing with the measuring tape where you line it up and you count. And why is this important, you may ask? This is important because the count determines the size of the pattern you're going to be making. So, if I am using 14 count, so if I have a pattern that says it is 70 stitches by 56, you can also find this on your pattern. So if this is 70 stitches going across and 56 stitches going down, I can figure out how big my pattern, just the pattern part, is going to be. So let's just say, just draw a diagram. It's going to be like that, and it's going to be a little shorter. So this is 70 and then 56 stitches. All right, this is important. We can take this and divide it by the count of fabric we are going to be using. So in this case, we're going to do 14. So we can do use your calculator here, but I can do this by hand. 70 divided by 14 is 5. Don't worry, I won't do it the long way. I should not have done it this way here. But it's going to be 5 inches because we're doing the per inch thing. So whatever stitches you have divided by, so we're going to do stitches divided by count equals inches. This is important because that is going to be the size of the design you're going to be making. Now we do that horizontally, we also do it vertically. So we'll just do this up here. 56 divided by 14 equals 4 inches. Stitches divided by 14 count, 4 inches. And this is important because knowing this and this, we know that this is actually 5 inches by 4 inches. And that's usable. Now, here's the thing. We don't want a piece of fabric that is the exact same size as our pattern. That's not going to leave us any space for finishing. So what we want instead is a little bit extra. So this is going to be our pattern. And then we want a little bit of extra space around it that is going to be for finishing. And this is our border. So we're going to want to count going sideways. We're going to want to count this border, the size of the pattern, and then this border here. And going up and down, we want to do that. So we're going to have this border, the pattern, and then this border. So whatever number of inches we want for our border, we're going to double it. So the typical standard recommendation for a border is 3 inches on each side. So that'd be 3 inches here, 3 inches here, 3 inches here, and 3 inches here. It's a little bit overkill, but you want 3 inches for 2 reasons. One, you want to have enough to be able to frame your piece or finish it off however you want. No matter what you're doing, 3 inches on each side is going to definitely be enough. You need at least 1 inch, ideally 3. Also, if something happens, like sometimes Aida is not perfect, because remember, this is the cheap shit. It can be good, but most often it is cheap shit. So when you have the cheap shit, it's not always perfectly square. Sometimes you're going to get one row or column that is bigger than the others or smaller than the others. Things don't always wind up exactly perfect. So because life isn't perfect, you always want to have a little bit of extra space for error, which is why 3 inches is good. So if we're going to have 3 inches plus 5 inches plus 3 inches, that's 5. So 3 plus 3 is 6. That's 11 inches wide. And we want to do that the same. So we've got 4 inches plus 3 inches plus 3 inches. So 3 plus 3 is 6. 6 plus 4 is 10 inches long. Or tall, or high, or whatever. So you're going to, in the end, want 11 inches by 10 inches. And that's the piece of fabric you need. Now you can cut that off of a bigger piece. You can get a piece that's pretty close to that size. That's kind of the minimum size you want. It gets a little tricky when you're dealing with fractional inches and stuff, but this is generally how you want to do it. Now the reason count matters is because if I was doing this on 28 count, so this is all 14 count. This will down here will be 28 count. Now, 56 divided by 28 is 2 inches. 2 inches compared to 4 inches. That is half the size. And if I did 70 divided by 28, instead of 5 inches, you're going to get 2.5 inches. Now, if you still want that 6 inches, for 3 plus 3 on each side, that's going to be 2 plus 6 equals 8 inches. And that's going to be 2.5 plus 6 equals 8.5 inches. That really affects, 11 by 10 versus 8 inch by 8.5 inches. And on particularly large pieces, where if you are going to be doing a piece on 14 count that winds up being 50 inches wide, versus you wind up doing a piece that is on 28 count and it's going to be 25 inches wide. That will save you a ton in a professional frame. Not to mention, it's going to be considerably smaller. You'll be able to get away, 56 inches one direction, because 50 plus 6 is 56 versus 25 plus 6 is 31 inches. It's much easier to find a single piece of fabric that fits that. It's going to be far less expensive overall. You're also going to be using less thread. Now, there is a concept called over 1 or over 2. Your pattern is going to tell you if you're going to be cross stitching over 1 or over 2. So it's usually written, let's move over here, as you're going to be stitching 2 over 1 or 2 over 2. We'll talk about these twos later, but the over 1 and over 2 means something specific. It means that when you're picking your box, over 1 means you're going to be doing a cross in one box. Over 2, because you see over 1, you are going over 1 and over 1. Now, if you were going to go over 2, let's do it over here. You're going to go over 2. You're starting here and you're going over 2, and then you're going down. So we'll start from here and you'll go over 2. So your X is actually going to be twice as big. And this is important because if you're doing what's called fractional stitches, so you've got a quarter stitch, or you've got a half stitch, or you've got a 3/4 stitch, so you're not making a full X. It's a lot easier to have this hole here in the middle instead of trying to spread your little threads in your fabric apart to get that little hole in a fractional stitch. Like, you could totally do that here, and it just means it's a lot easier with a sharper needle. But if you're doing over 2, it's a lot easier. And here's the cool thing. You can do over 2 on double the count, because let's take the 14. 14 count times 2. 2 times 4 is 8. 2 times 1 is 2. That's 28 count. So this is double this. So it's literally, if you have 14 count, say you've got 1, 2. Let's pretend this is 14 count. That is 14 count right there. Now, if you were doing, that would be over 1, because you've got 1 and 1. You see? So this is big. See, but 28 count would be half of that. So we'd have dots here, so ultimately, if we were going over 2 on 28 count, we would still be doing our X over the same size as the 14 count, because each of the 28 count stitches are a quarter of the size, versus that. This would be over 1 on the 28 count. And there's a lot of them that do that. If you have a 16 count, (32 count can be done over 2 to equal a 16 count. 18 times 2. 8 times 2 is 16. 36 count is equivalent to 18 count. So when you have this and you're trying to calculate the amount you need, you want the effective counts per inch, not the count of your fabric. So if I was going to use this instead of this, but I was going over 2 on this, it would effectively be the same as this, because this is 28 count, this is 14 count. 28 divided by 2 is 14, because 14 times 2 is 28. And you'd actually do division math. So 28 count fabric, and then you're doing over 2 equals 14 stitches per inch. Now this is a quick overview. There are other videos you can find that's going to go over one of these, but this is just your basic information when you start getting into the complex stuff. I hope this made sense. Now, why does all of this matter aside from the size of the fabric you're getting? It also determines the needle you're going to use. And it's also going to determine how many plies of your thread you're going to also need to use. So let's go over needles first real quick. Depending on the count of your fabric, not the effective count, but the actual count of your fabric, determines the size of the needle you're going to use. And typically, the bigger the number, the smaller the needle. And you can see this definitely happens here. So this is a size 18 needle, and you can see how much bigger it is than the size 24 needles, which in and of itself, they are bigger than the 26. So the easiest way for me to remember this is the back half of the number has to match. So for 14 count, so 14 is 1/4, you need 24 needles. For 16 count fabric, you need 26 needles, size 26. For 18 count fabric, you need 28, which I don't have. Now it gets a little trickier because these 18 size typically go for like 11 count fabric or can, or something bigger than that. And there are petites. So when you get into the 24, 25 higher count fabrics, you can get the little petites, which are even thinner. Now, the thing you'll want to notice is that the holes, the eye of the needle, also gets smaller on the smaller needles. So be aware of that. And also, don't overload your needle. This needle cannot hold as many threads as this needle can. This can take all 6 strands of a DMC thread, or floss, as we like to call it. I use thread and floss interchangeably. Technically, it's floss. It's done a little differently than thread. Now, all right, here it is. This is a DMC brand floss, and you will see that it has plies. Each one of these plies is its own strand, and there are 6 strands. We're going to talk more about thread and floss in the next video, but you can see how this giant needle can hold all of these easily. 14 count, or the size 24 needle, typically only holds 2 to 3 strands. You will separate these out to put in here and thread this one up. And typically, size 26 needles, so 16 count fabric, usually only has 2 strands. It's helpful to just memorize that. It's a lot easier. The more thread you have, the better the coverage is going to be on your finished project. I think I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in the floss, because this really comes down to how you're handling your floss. But sometimes you want more coverage. So when you make your X's, there can be a little bit of space. All right, going back to the diagram, just because I have some, you can see how at the top, bottom, and sides of the X's, there's always a chance for the fabric to peek through your stitches. So if you're doing something like this, where you are trying to cover an area of your fabric, having more threads is going to cover this better. So you want to make sure you have enough thread, enough floss, so that you are not showing too much of the fabric behind. Now this comes down to personal preferences. So if you want something that's going to cover kind of this area over here a little bit more, like up here and down here, you'll want more strands, because you see as I put more strands in there, I'm going to switch, make this thicker, it covers it better. Now you don't want it too thick, because remember, part of cross stitch does create texture. So having more coverage can wind up with a more solid looking thing. But if you get it too bulky, it also can kind of look a little funny. So it really is a balancing act of how much you want. This is particularly poignant on 14 count, because you can cover 14 count with 2 strands of floss or 3 strands of floss. And it's just sometimes you want it, sometimes you don't. Like I did this project that is my husband's grandparents. And the whole reason it looks like an old photo is honestly because I didn't have perfect coverage. You can see in the darker colored flosses that there is a little bit of the white peeking through. And ultimately it worked in this project's favor because it made it look more old-timey photo. But some people don't like that. They want a little bit better coverage and a more intense dark color or light color on dark fabric. This happens a lot. Like if I were to do anything on this fabric, because it's so intensely red, because this is so intensely red, I'm going to want more strands of floss for better coverage. So that red only pops through as background, not inside my stitching. So now that you know all of that, let's talk about actually picking a fabric, because as you can see, there are options. Because it really depends on what you're going to be doing. Now, obviously, I would use this for a bookmark, but I honestly use Aida for anything. The cheaper the better, especially if you're doing full coverage. Because here's the thing about full coverage. That means every single stitch is covered. You're not going to see the background of it. So I would go the cheapest one for anything full coverage. I do a lot of full coverage pieces. Aida makes a lot of sense. You might want a higher quality Aida, because you want it to still feel nice. And a high quality Aida can definitely feel nice. Like this feels lovely. This is also Aida. But if you're going to see the background, it's a matter of what you want it to look like. So for example, if I was going to do more of an intense dragon with a whole bunch of blues and greens, I might very well choose this kind of purpley-ish, Wedgwood, whatever, color. That's not white. It's kind of purple. But if I wanted more of a rustic look, I might go for this one. You also want to pick the count based on the size that you want. As you saw in the example earlier, I might want something a little bit smaller. So I might choose a fabric that is 36 count and use it as a 16 count instead of a 14 count. So I might choose this 36 count over this 28 count, because this is an effective 16 count and this is an effective 14 count. I might want it a little bit smaller. So if I want it a little smaller, I'll use this one. But if I want it a little bigger, I might use this one, especially since this has a lovely kind of sky pattern. And this is part of what makes cross stitch an art, because two people can do the exact same pattern with the exact same floss, and because they chose a different background, it can look completely different. And that's the joy of this kind of thing. So that's why this is a little extra complicated. So I hope this makes sense to you. I know this was a lot of information. My recommendation, honestly, is to watch this a few times as you gain more experience with cross stitch. I do expect that prior to this video, you have done cross stitch before. So take what you need from this video right now. As you gain experience, feel free to come back and re-watch this video to understand more. I got all these fabrics from 123 Stitch. I am not sponsored, but I will provide a link because they are an excellent company. And happy crafting. See you next week to talk all about floss. Bye.